So today's occasion, we're delighted today to be joined by the Minister who will be hosting us today. And indeed, thank you very much to the Department of Foreign Affairs, the Taoiseach's office, and to the Irish Government in general, who collaborate with us very closely on an ongoing basis, and we're delighted with that cooperation. The Minister will open. Ivailo, our Executive Director from Eurofound, will then address just very briefly, and he will introduce our star speaker today, Ivan Krastev, who will indeed be looking at living, working and voting in Europe. So without further ado, if I could just ask you and remind you to switch your phones off. I know it's a bit boring, but if you could do so, please, and we will get on with proceedings. So, Minister, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to welcome you here to Ivy House this morning at the beginning of Europe Week and to celebrate what we all love best, the freedom, democracy and solidarity that is the European Union and what it has been and how it continues to evolve. It's fantastic to be here to be able to welcome our fantastic guest speaker, Ivan Krastev, to speak about living, working and voting in Europe. And having had just a few minutes to speak with him in advance of coming up here, I know it's going to be a really important and insightful analysis that I think we will benefit from very considerably. And I'd really like to commend the team in Eurofound, which is my favourite European agency, not just because of the quality of the research that they produce, and I do like good research, but because, of course, they're based in Loughlinstown in my constituency, which I particularly like. So research and local, that's fine by me, so I do love them. So it's fantastic. You'll hear now from Ivailo very shortly, and thank you so much to Christina and the team responsible for putting this together. The theme of this morning's lecture is a reflection on the challenges and the opportunities currently faced by the European Union, and what is probably one of the most challenging times for the European Union, probably one of the times most necessary to set real strategic direction, but real thought about how we are going to continue to manage what I fear will be challenges that are not going to go away, particularly in relation to disinformation and the disruption to established liberal democracies and the way in which that's been done in a nefarious and deliberate way by nefarious and deliberate actors. It's particularly important year given not just the European Parliament elections, but given the number of domestic elections in which we are seeing this playing out, and of course a particularly important year given the significance of the US presidential election, which we would all like to be very much more boring than it will be, and very much less significant than I fear it could be. But it really is a very strategic and important moment. And so at this time, more than any other time, it is important that we sit down and reflect on the deep analysis that's available to us this morning. Obviously, our key priorities in relation to rule of law, the preservation of democracy, the preservation of fundamental freedoms rest on our ability to continue the liberal democracies and the standards that we have within those liberal democracies that we have enjoyed, I hope not taken for granted, for some many years, but that we continue to identify the challenges and to adapt as necessary our institutions to preserve the standards of democracy that we have had. We have a rule of law challenge in the European Union, though I am so pleased to see the progress that Poland has made and the very different political progress, the very different political steps that Poland has taken, and it is to their eternal eternal goodwill to Poland for having managed to reverse in such an important way a stream that was going very badly wrong. But we have this rule of law challenge not just with assessing our candidate countries, but managing in particular those existing countries where we have established democracies that are being threatened from within. Whether or not, and not just what we've seen to date, but identifying real ways of measuring how we're going to manage our own existing member states, recognising the threat that is coming from within through the amplification of dissent, through the increasing use of disinformation, and how we protect our democracies. My PhD thesis was about political institutions, democratic institutions, how to design them, how they go badly wrong because you're not paying attention to the institutional design, how institutions can drift because of the behaviour of individual actors who are not necessarily nefarious but who might be casual, who might not be paying attention, and how institutions can end up doing one thing when they were designed to do another. We have a very different situation here, which is that we have well-designed political institutions that have been working well, and it's not that we've taken our eye off the ball, but we haven't yet considered how to manage effectively, efficiently and crucially with legitimacy the threat from within of deliberately nefarious actors, both externally and internally and at the same time, and what that does to the preservation of the institutions, the democratic institutions that we have looked after so well. One of the questions within that, and if you think back to the Brexit referendum, a failure, if I may say, of the United Kingdom's political institutions was the absence of a referendum commission, born almost certainly by not having had referendums and not having in many ways screwed them up, and having to develop the institutions as a catch-up in the way that Ireland developed a referendum commission. But the consequence of having a referendum commission was, of course, being able to monitor and manage referendums in a very transparent way. The presence of a High Court judge on a Monday or a Friday morning answering questions on the radio in a predictable way. It wasn't in response to a crisis, it was happening anyway. It's a very good way of managing referendums. Whether you win them or you lose them, there's a political institutional credibility to the management of them that retains the legitimacy of the process. In contrast, the absence of a referendum commission during the Brexit referendum, of course, meant that ridiculous statements went entirely unchallenged by an authoritative source that had authority not just because of their particular position in society, but because of the absence of a political institutional legitimacy that had gone behind it. So the institutions matter, and watching the institutions matter very much. Of course, here we are trying to enhance that with the establishment of a better electoral commission, but the single biggest challenge that is going to be is not whether I spend €10,000 or €10,250 in the general election or its equivalent, but it is of course going to be the management of misinformation and disinformation. There is a phenomenally good article in The Economist this week in relation to disinformation and how that's being used, the role of AI in disinformation, and of course there's a very good story about President Zelensky's wife and the disinformation around her spending, for example. But as an elected politician, I can tell you that these things are true. It is an established fact on social media, a fact no less, that I managed to get some kind of corrupt contract for my brother's company during COVID. I don't even have a brother, right? So, but these things become true. They become true because it's counterproductive to try to disrupt them in the first instance, and the very act of disruption by the elected person only serves to amplify them further, so they become true. So the management, and so that article, but of course the Washington Post did a phenomenal piece, I think it was the 11th of April, in the same way, tracking how this is being done, how it's being planted through legitimate actors and then being spread and so on. You are familiar with this, you are all working in this space, you're well aware, but it is by far, it is a challenge that is very difficult for political institutions to manage and to consider, but it is going to become important because its output is going to be the elections of people with very contrary views to those that we have protected in terms of the rule of law, humanitarianism, the protection of the European Union, and I think it's something that is of major concern. So we're all aware of the rule of law challenge that is coming. We're all aware of how that is, interlinked with the European Parliament and other elections in 2024, 2025. It is a very, very significant time in Europe. It is a very significant time for political actors in Europe. There has never been a stronger case for articulating a vision of Europe in very different changed circumstances. The peace and the security and the trajectory that we have enjoyed and taken for granted through the various streams of accession, and as we have gotten to 2024, is, I fear, being very, very considerably challenged, and it is time to reflect on that in our political institutions and how we communicate around the next series of elections to try to protect what we have created for the next 50 years. I am really looking forward to the lecture this morning, and thank you so much for allowing me to host you this morning.
Well, thank you, Minister. There's nothing like setting us up at the top standard of inspiration and motivation. So we're very grateful for your input this morning and starting us off, and indeed for hosting us again. Our thanks to the Department and to the Government of Ireland. We have a very high calibre in the room today, and as you've heard this morning, I would also like to take this opportunity to introduce our own Director Director of the Minister's Favourite EU Agency. You've heard that, it's on record, and we will replay that throughout the whole of next year on our 50th anniversary of Eurofound's existence. But our director, Ivailo Kalfin, is no stranger either to the world of diplomacy and to the ministerial ranks. He has been a foreign minister of Bulgaria twice and a deputy prime minister. He also has been a member of the European Parliament, and in this year of elections, I think it's very useful for Eurofound to be able to draw on his insights and experience in this area and to have him be at the forefront of the work that we do during this time. So, Ivailo.
Thank you very much, Mary, Madam Minister, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear Ivan. Thank you very much for coming today. This is the second annual lecture that Eurofound started organizing in Dublin, and we are extremely grateful again to the Minister for European Affairs, to the Department of Foreign Affairs, for giving us the possibility to have this lecture in this beautiful and important place. The idea is to have a good conversation with an interesting speaker about what are the challenges of Europe. And we always try to see where our agency stays within this agenda and how we could better respond to the policymakers, governments, trade unions, employers' organizations in tackling this agenda. So today I'm very happy that we have another very interesting speaker. Before giving the floor to Ivan, I would like to briefly introduce an aspect which is not very often in our research. And this is mostly what we foresee and what lays ahead, or what could be the challenges after the forthcoming elections in the next political cycle. Definitely, the European Union is a good place to live and work. I mean, this is clear for the 450 million people, citizens living in the European Union, maybe for the 140 in these countries that expressed interest to join our union, maybe for the 100,000 on an annual basis migrants that come, and these numbers are peaking whenever there is something hot around Europe, war conflict. So for quite a lot of millions of people, Europe is a good place to live. It has to do probably with what we are trying to research and to provide information with the working conditions, with the living conditions, with the values of the European Union, both in that are enshrined in the European Charter of Human Rights, but also new rights, and I think about the data protection in Europe, about the Artificial Intelligence Act that further go in the modern times protecting human rights. And we have seen over the last period very bold moves of the European Union to protect these values. And again, to give one or two examples, this is the massive SURE program that supported more than 32 million jobs in Europe, that allowed Europe to exit the deepest economic downturn since the war, since its creation practically, within less than 2 years. As a comparison, the previous crisis in 2008 took more than 6 years to return to the same levels. And this is very much due to the European-wide policy. I mean, these are examples where there is no possibility for any single member state to cope without a common European approach to that. The Resilience and Reform Facility and the Next Generation EU, which again is a massive effort, a milestone, allowing the member states to turn over their economies, I mean, to find more competitiveness in them. But also recent acts like the Minimum Wages Directive, like the Platform Workers Directive, like the Platform Work Directive, like the AI Act that I already mentioned, or the Pay Transparency Directive. All these are elements in the legislative part that bring more assurance to exactly the preservation of these values and the development of these values that we all have. But looking ahead, I think that we have both internal and external factors. Internally, certainly topics as housing, as labor shortages, especially the ones that are structural, that are not dependent on the economic cycle, like, for example, the care workers, or different other sectors where we definitely need more labor force. Demography is going to be certainly on the agenda. Green transition, Europe is leading in the green transition in the world. All these are very important domestic issues. At the same time, we are going to face huge global challenges, apparently, in the next political cycle and in the next term. And here we link very much with our speaker today and what he's going to tell us. I would outline three of these challenges. First is peace. Tomorrow we mark 9 years after the end of the last war in Europe, the Second World War. Next year is going to be 80 years. This is the longest ever period in Europe without wars. Some years ago, I was trying, as a member of the European Parliament, very enthusiastic to calculate the value added of Europe and to show it in figures. There are things that you cannot show in figures, like the peace in Europe. And the peace is threatened now within a very aggressive neighbor, which showed that sometimes common sense and logic is not prevailing in the political actions. So I'm sure that peace and how to preserve peace and how to walk this very narrow line of supporting Ukraine for their just cause, preserving their territorial integrity, and not dragging Europe into a war is going to be very challenging and very important for all policymakers in the future. How to contain an aggressor, how to keep an aggressor away from Europe. So that's certainly going to be one of the major topics for the next term. Second, competitiveness. And we see with all these recent reports, both published and unpublished, but already appearing, Enrico Letta's report, Mario Draghi's report, speaking about competitiveness, Europe is going to look for a better place, a more assertive place in the European economy. And I think that maybe it's going to be one of the focuses of the next Commission, looking at the political climate also. So the Member States, the Parliament are going to ask the Commission to suggest measures in order to increase the Europe's competitiveness, including moving from interdependence to more autonomy, or at least added value in some key technological sectors. Interdependence was a very good economic concept. I have to admit that I was also a big adept of this concept. The war in Ukraine showed that it's not valid, because everybody thought, we said Europe is importing 40% of the gas from Russia, but Russia is exporting 80% of the gas to Europe. So who has the highest interest to keep this market? Certainly Russia. Certainly there was an interdependence. Now Russia doesn't have a market in Europe. They have to go to China and ask the Communist Party office what are going to be the prices of the gas. The gas and the energy supplies are cheaper than before the war in Europe, so Europe succeeded to survive this. But again, this whole idea of interdependence apparently was not what brought peace and stability in Europe. So apparently sometimes there are some additional concepts. And maybe Ivan is going to mention the elections in the US, etc., etc. Everything which happens in the world around Europe means that Europe has to be stronger in terms of promoting its own economic, political interests, its integrity, defense, etc., etc. And this is going to have an impact on what we are researching also at Eurofound in terms of changes of economy, all these issues with onshoring, reshoring, nearshoring, etc., etc., change of the structure of the economy related to skills, to research also, to the different tools how to enable Europe to do that. And lastly, the last one, not to underestimate it, this is the climate change, and not only from the point of view of the green transition that we are doing, but because of the climate change in the world. We are lucky to have one of the minor effect so far of the global warming. But we see regions in the world where the effect is massive. And this is going to trigger, sooner or later, a massive migration flows. And we have to see that, and we have to be clear with that. So taking care of the environment also takes care about this, because we see huge deserted areas with quite dense population. We see different natural disasters across the world, and they're very much linked to the climate. So the efforts to induce a world policy on climate preservation is also going to be there. So these are at least 3 of the challenges that we have, and I think that we have the best person to speak about global changes and global policies today. This is Ivan Krastev. I'm not sure that I have to present very much Ivan Krastev, because to many of you he's known from different appearances. Ivan is a political scientist, one of the best authors for global processes, for whatever happened in Eastern Europe. He's my compatriot. We are both from Bulgaria. So we have witnessed the whole transition of the Eastern Europe to democracy. I mean, some of these books, I mean, there is a prize-winning book of Ivan, The Light That Failed, which is not too optimistic, but I think that as a whole, the whole transition of the Central Eastern Europe towards the European Union was a great achievement of our populations, but he's the one to speak about that. He's chair of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia. He's a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. He's a founding board member of the European Council for Foreign Relations, very often publishing commentaries and opinions within the ECFR. Ivan is also a former member of the International Commission for the Balkans. He was the director of this International Commission under the leadership of the former Italian Prime Minister Giuliano Amato. He was editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy, the Bulgarian edition of Foreign Policy. Ivan is contributing. I mean, I'm not going to go through with your permission, Ivan, on all the list of your membership of boards of trustees, directors, etc., etc. But he's one of the, I would say, most influential political scientists in Europe. He's also a columnist in Financial Times and New York Times. So quite often you can see his columns and his opinions in these newspapers. He produced several books. I think we could borrow some of those for our research, because this very much coincides with what we are doing, like can democracy survive when we don't trust our leaders? And Eurofound started measuring trust during COVID with the e-survey. And this is really very important to see not only what are the policy measures, but how they find a response among the citizens and the population. And another one that Ivan published during COVID is Tomorrow Yet, Paradoxes of the Pandemic. I think this is his last book, very much on topics that Eurofound was very much involved in measuring during the pandemic, and we were maybe one of the very few, if not the only, research center that was all the time analyzing every 6 months during COVID what happens with the work, with the life of the people, with trust in governments, in medical experts, etc., etc. So that's a very interesting read also, and very much in line with what we are doing. So with this, we also identified, we just finalized an exercise making our multi-annual program until 2029. We see 4 global driving factors. One of them is geopolitics this time, together along with digitalization, climate change, demography, which certainly stay there. We see that maybe in the next year geopolitics is going to be more and more important, and we will try. We are also already taking measures to involve it in the policy, in the programming of our research, in order to be available for the policymakers. Without this, I would like to finish and to pass the floor to Ivan Krastev. Again, very welcome and happy to have you here, Ivan. Have the floor.
Thank you very much. You already had 2 great lectures. So if the third one is going to disappoint you, it's not going to be a major catastrophe. And there's really 3 very special reasons to be very thankful to be here. This is the first time I'm in Ireland. But this is not the most interesting, but just very recently I finished a book about Ireland. And this was Fintan O'Toole's book, We Don't Know Ourselves. And to be honest, I found the book absolutely fascinating. So from this point of view, when you know basics and when you go and try to see how the country has changed, I found this really, really interesting and great privilege. The second privilege is very much due to the fact that, like many others, I'm one of the customers of the research that Eurofound is doing. So this is kind of a returning cadet, and as you know, James Bond was famous for the license to kill, so probably you're one of the European institutions with the license to think. And this is kind of a good story. And thirdly, I'm Bulgarian, this is not a secret anymore, we are not famous for respecting our politicians very much. But I have a lot of personal respect for Ivailo Kalfin, of his time as in government, and even for this was going to be almost impossible for me to say no. But I'm saying this also because we're in an interesting time. Just today, at this moment, I can imagine that President von der Leyen is going to give her version of the Sorbonne speech in Katowice with Prime Minister Tusk. And obviously, there is a general sense that these elections are going to matter, not simply because of the election results, but probably that Europe is facing questions that have not been facing before. And I'm saying this because normally in front of every elections, political scientists are going to argue that probably this is the most dramatic elections. And by the way, Tocqueville, being in America in the 19th century, discovered that this is how democracy works. Before elections coming, you basically claim that this is over dramatic and basically these are problems that nobody can solve. And after the election's over, basically the problems have been kind of normalized. But this time I really do believe that we're in a moment in which some important things are really changing. And the first thing that is changing is the context. I had an opportunity to see President Macron 2 days before his speech. And what struck me was that outside of the content, which we all know now, is that he shared something that was very typical for East Europeans and not necessarily for West Europeans. Normally, East Europeans of my generation, we know how fast the things can change. Believe me, in the mid-1980s, communism system in Bulgaria was stable like nature. You can like it or dislike it, but we were not Poland. We were not Czechoslovakia. We were not Hungary. You have the feeling that you know how the world is going to look like in the next 20 years. And then suddenly, over weeks, the things are starting changing to the extent that on Friday, you don't believe what you have been thinking on Monday. I'm never going to forget on the night when basically our communist leader, Todor Zhivkov, resigned. By accident, we had been on a meeting with one of the later leaders of the opposition, Zhelyu Zhelev, and he was telling to some of us, he said, young people, you're young, you're going to see the end of communism in your lifetime. 6 months later, he was the president of the country. I'm saying this because in my view, this is what Macron got right is not necessarily the direction of the change, but the speed. The things are going to start changing very fast. And they're going to change very fast. And from this point of view, I do believe that Europe is in a kind of a vertigo moment. And Milan Kundera, the famous Czech writer, has, in my view, a great definition of vertigo. He says, vertigo, this is not the fear of falling. Vertigo is the desire to fall against which heroically we struggle. This is not simply that basically all the things that were taken for granted suddenly are not there. So when I'm talking about these elections, I'm going to make just 2 important points. One is that in 2019, the European elections were quite important because it was after Brexit and it was after Trump. And then the story was in or out. Back then, 19 parties of some importance have been openly advocating for exiting either the Union or the Euro. And it was a kind of a polarized situation in which you have very clear pro-European anti-Europeans, and the pro-European tent prevailed. The interesting story is that now nobody is advocating, including the European Union or the Euro. But suddenly, you have a much more the fear of polarized fragmentation. You're going to end up with a parliament which, according to the most of the expectations and projections, is going to be really much more fragmented. And the majority is going to be much less clear and much less predictable than people normally believe. Even more, I'm going to argue that, strangely enough, this time European elections are going to be in 2 rounds. On the first, Europeans are going to vote. And on the second, in November, Americans are going to vote. And based on the result of the American elections, basically European majority and the agenda of the majority is going to change. There are going to be political parties, there are going to be national governments, which probably are going to adjust very much to the American vote, depending in which direction it will go. And this is exactly because of the fact that we basically are in a situation in which suddenly Europe is getting into the world for which we have not been prepared. And I'm going to say this because in our work in trying to make sense of these elections, and this is why I'm going to focus on voting, not so much on living and working, is based on the fact that we decided to study European elections as a result of the effect of the 5 crises that have been reshaping Europe for the last 15 years. One is climate. Everybody is talking about it. And plus what already was said by that Mr. Kalfin, that there were some estimations that you can expect up to 3 billion people moving. Listen, is this true or not? For me, it's very important to keep in mind. We cannot know. But people are living not only with reality, they are living with projections. Remember COVID, and from this point of view, COVID was an incredible moment because COVID first was a demographic awakening. The virus came, and then suddenly we all know exactly how old we are. Not how old we feel, how old we are. Suddenly we start to know the structure of our societies. By the way, suddenly we discovered in Bulgaria that the median age of the Bulgarian doctors is above 53 years. And also you start to live with projections. This is one of the things that in a strange way COVID did for the ordinary persons. I mean, researchers have been always living with predictions, projections, and so on. But suddenly you imagine how many people can be infected, what can go, where basically. This type of a non-linear development, which is not normal for this type of ordinary person, suddenly this was a major story. And I do believe we're in a period in which we start to think about this, and you have climate. And then you have the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, 2010. And it was devastating, particularly for, Ivan knows about this crisis a lot, but ask Spaniards and Greeks and so on, and they have a story to tell. You have the migration crisis. Then you have COVID. Then you have the war of Russia against Ukraine. All these 5 crises have several things in common. They were pan-European. By the way, this was the crisis that brought Europeans closer together than anything else. When the economic crisis started, suddenly Germans became an experts on Greek economic policies. But then the migration crisis came and we all became, in Eastern Europe, a specialist on the German asylum policies. So suddenly countries started to be interested in each other in the way they had not been interested before. And as a result of it, all these crises basically also divided Europe in different ways. The economic crisis, it was very much the South-East divide. And then you have the migration crisis, which was very much the East-West divide. And you have the war in Ukraine, which was first East-West, but after that became East-East. So I'm saying all this because also all this crisis, European Union in a certain way managed to deal with, and this was part of the legitimacy of the Union, and this is why nobody wants to get out. But keep in mind, institutionally, in every single case, European Union succeeded by doing something which is not in the treaties. everything was out-of-a-box institutional solution. Everything was something very specific, something that should not have happened if we had been following the institutions. And the interesting story is also that this crisis, like a medieval ghosts, were coming back. So economic crisis, it started as a crisis of the euro. A decade later, it came as an inflation crisis. Russian war in Ukraine, it didn't start in 2022. It started in 2014 and came back in 2022 and came in a totally different form. And migration crisis, basically it was 2015, 2016, but if you're going to see the number of people who entered Europe, particularly also when you're going to see refugees from Ukraine, you're going to see that in 2022, 2023, the numbers were higher. So why I'm saying this? Because on one level, even people that were very critical to the European Union suddenly understood that their nation states do not have capacity to deal with this world. And this is true not only for countries like Bulgaria. This is true even for the big European states. It was true even for France. It's true even for Germany. Suddenly, the world has changed so much that they are not big enough. You don't have the capacity, you don't have the money, you simply don't have the capacity. But on the other side, Europeans managed to do this. There is no idea to get out. But if you go on our surveys, you're going to see that majority of the people believe that European Union didn't manage to do it. And when I said European Union, it also includes the national government. It's not that the national governments are doing well. For the first time, the national governments and European Union are not divided. So it's not Euroscepticism anymore, it's Europessimism. And it's exactly what was said. Not how we are doing today, how we are going to do in 10 years, how we are going to do in 20 years. And I'm saying this because all of this crisis challenged some basic assumptions on which European Union was based. I'm going to start with the war in Ukraine, which I know better. And there was 5 important things that we believed in and which turned to be wrong. And by the way, we believed them for good reasons. One was interdependency. People are now accusing Chancellor Merkel or the Germans that they were basically been totally naive to believe that economic interdependence is enough to secure peace. But this is what Germans did with everybody. This is what Germans did with French. This is what they did with Poles, and it worked. So in a certain way, we became not the victim of our failures, but of our successes. It was the success to pacify European mind that suddenly became the problem. The second story, which was very important, particularly after 2003, and if you're going to look at the security doctrine of the European Union, which was written just after the war in Iraq, Europeans, we managed to convince ourselves that military power doesn't matter. We said, okay, Americans were so powerful, so what? And listen, when the war in Ukraine started, Ukraine has ammunition for 6 weeks. A very big European states that I'm not going to name had ammunition for 6 days. We have basically started to believe that the war is impossible, and the level of investment in defense capacities, where in many countries basically defense budgets are much more social budgets than anything which has any type of military relevance, created a situation in which basically Europe felt vulnerable as never before. By the way, this is not the first war in the last 70 years. There was the war in Yugoslavia. In war in Yugoslavia, a lot of people died. But this is for the first time that Europeans realized that we can end up in a war, which was not the case in Yugoslavia. The third thing that also was dramatically changed was the nature of the American security guarantees. Before, governments, presidents were changing in the United States. Europeans liked some more than others. But there was no doubt that in a situation of a major crisis or clash, you can rely on the Americans. And now, basically, this was questioned for the first time. And suddenly, this cannot be taken for granted, and suddenly, basically, what is going to happen started to very much depend on what is going to happen on the American elections. But even beyond the American elections, you start to understand the America is much more China-focused, so from this point of view, from the geopolitical perspective of the United States, Europe is in a position in which Japan was during the Cold War. We are not on the major theater. Secondly, we see the rise of the middle powers. Very different countries. India, Turkey, this is not a non-alignment movement, but these are countries which are hyperactive. And the world which before, during the Cold War, alliances have been really like Catholic marriages. You get in, and you're there forever. Only the Pope can divorce you. And now suddenly we're living in a world which starts to resemble basically a dating app. Everybody is going around, everybody is looking for new partners, very transactional, satisfaction not guaranteed. So from this point of view, I do believe that Europe was not prepared for this world, and particularly keeping in mind that the free trade was so important for the European Union, and you see the rise of protectionism everywhere. China and the cheap exports and everything that obviously discussed during the Chinese leader visit, but you have also the Inflation Reduction Act on the United States, which was a major subsidy for certain type of American industries, and here comes the problem. Does Europeans have a will and capacity to subsidize? And by the way, subsidizing does not mean that Bulgaria is going to do it. Some countries are going to have much more to put than the others. So in a certain way, you should ask Germans particularly to put money which is not necessary to be in support of German companies. I do believe that this question theoretically was always there, but in the kind of a free trade world, everything about competition was the competition within the European Union, the competition within the single market. And suddenly it's not about the competition in the single market, it's about the possibility of European companies to compete globally, keeping in mind that technologically we're not doing fine. And even more, the idea of Europe as a regulating power when it comes to technologies made sense if they're going to be a global market. But now when we see a technological war between the Americans and Chinese, who is going to allow us to regulate? Chinese or Americans? It is some major assumptions. The other assumptions that was very much challenged, and as a result of the war, was the role of nationalism. Bertolt Brecht's famous poetic line that he feels pity for countries that need heroes, in my view, was very popular in Europe till the moment when you understand that the only reasons that Ukrainians succeed for 2 years now to resist the Russians was because of the mobilizing power of the Ukrainian nationalism. There are moments in which you need heroes. Because for Europeans, death and sacrifice was not in the social contract. But in a moment of a situation like this, suddenly the question, who is ready to die for the system that we represent, is becoming a relevant question. And listen, all these questions are coming. The problem of migration. By the way, honestly speaking, and this is a good story to be political scientist and not to be any institutional, there's several issues that are going to come up. One is, Europeans, we always have been claiming, starting with 2015, that we are open to refugees, but we have a problem with illegal economic migrants. The reality is just the opposite. We are open to economic migrants, and we are not particularly fond of refugees. And the problem is not that Europe is going to close itself, but Europe wants to have the right to choose who is coming and who is not coming. And by the way, the choices on the level of the different nation states is different. Poland was a country that in 2015 said that they are not ready to get 20,000 people. When the war in Ukraine started, there were millions. 8% of households in Poland were personally taking care of the Ukrainian families. So obviously this is not a just abstract question about migration. You're open to some and you're not open for others. You're going to say that this is because of race or religion. Probably. But not only this. There was a war with which you can identify. And I'm saying this because one of the things that made a strong impression talking about the research was the incredible impact on the fact the Ukrainian refugees, many of them are living with their pets. And when you start, anthropologists start to asking people, and they said, there are no illegal immigrants who go with their pets. There are people who simply left their houses and they get basically everything that they love and so on and so on. I'm saying this because all these 5 crises, according to our research, created a tribes. We asked people, out of these 5 crises, when you think about the future, which one you feel is the most important? And the size of the tribes, by the way, are quite similar, but the geography is very different. You go to Sweden and Poland, and they're going to tell you that the most important is the war in Ukraine. You go to Spain, and people are going still to believe that the most important is COVID. And COVID has 2 impressions. This type of a COVID tribe has 2 totally different segments. One are people who are afraid that Europe is not prepared for the next pandemic. The other is who believe that the arrival of pandemic was the arrival of the new authoritarianism. There is very strong anti-vax group, for example, very strongly in places like Austria and others, where they said, because there was a imposed vaccination to everybody. And nevertheless, that Austria in general did quite well in terms of basically what they managed to achieve. 24% approved the government's action, 48% opposed them. And then you have the economic tribe, which is very strong when it comes to countries like Portugal, like Italy. And climate was number one when it comes to Netherlands and France. Migration was number one in only one country, paradoxically, but in a big way, and it was Germany. 31% of the Germans believe that this is the biggest crisis. The question being asked like this. And here comes also a very interesting asymmetry that, by the way, when we talk about migration, also keep in mind that there are two very different fears going into one. One is the fear or the anxiety of other people coming, but not weaker is the fear of how many of your own people are living. And before this was East European, Ireland knows this probably historically better than many others. This was very strong in East European countries. Around 15% of the population of Bulgaria has left since 1989. By the way, Bulgaria is demographically the fastest demographically shrinking country in human history in the absence of war or natural disaster. You have standard European fertility rates, but at the same time, basically the life expectancies was slightly lower than in Western Europe, and major outmigration. And people are never going to understand how important demography is becoming in anything that is Europe-related, and I'm very much interested basically on the work that the fund is going to do on this. Because nobody, for example, is going to understand the logic of the Ukrainian government to decide till now not to mobilize people who are younger than 27, if you don't know basically how bleak is their demographic profile and how big is the fear that if young people are going to be killed, basically, there are going to be less and less people being born. So I'm saying all this because this is a type of a problem, some of them so short-term and the others so long-term that it is very difficult to deal with. So we look at this crisis and we basically understand that all of this kind of a crisis tribes have a logic of their own, they have a demography of their own. For example, for sure, climate is a bigger problem for the younger generation than for people older than 65. So they're also dividing people differently. But also when it comes to politics, two of these tribes has a very clear political projections. If you believe that migration is the major issue, you're going to vote either far right or center right. If you basically believe that climate is the biggest issue, you're going to vote on the progressive left, green but not necessary. And here comes a very interesting asymmetry. When the far right is in power, in none of the countries the number of illegal migrants has declined. Italy, for example, basically there was a major rise of people who illegally crossed the country since Mrs. Meloni is in power. But people get relaxed about migration. Migration is not the number one issue in Italy, which was when she was elected. Suddenly, people said probably she cannot stop migrants, but at least she's not happy with this. On the other side, when you see Greens in power, like in Germany, which managed to achieve, to be honest, not less. For the last 2 years, there were basically 20% decrease of carbon footprint in Germany. This is not something to be just neglected, but people get even more anxious. Supporting of the Green parties believes that not enough is done. All others believe that they're overdoing this, because what is now very clear, and the Greens, in my view, should take the message, is that people are giving them a mandate to change the world, but not their way of life. You change what you want, but not my boiler. And this is a political reality. You can like it or dislike it, but this is politics. People are voting. And I'm saying this because, and this is where I want to go with these major changes, is that when you have this, you have one more element that is becoming very difficult for Europe, but also for democracies in general. And this is, these two major groups, put it in its radical form, the great replacement right, and on the other, the radical climate left. They're very different in almost any aspects, with one thing that they have in common. They believe that we are living on a borrowed time. Both of them are forms of extinction rebellion. One basically believes that if we're not going to change our way of production and life, they're not going to be life in the world. And the other believes that if we're not going to stop migration, they're not going to be life for us. But as a result of it, they said everything should be done now. There is no future dimension. There is no time for compromises. In a certain way, you have a very apocalyptic view of what is going on. It's now or never. And this makes it very difficult for politics. Because democratic politics is based on the idea that tomorrow is always there. That the problem that we cannot solve today can be solved tomorrow. And this is what, in my view, is facing the European Union at this moment, is that on one level, from outside, you have the world which is changing very much. And by the way, the world that is seeing Europe very differently in the way we believed we are seeing. Just during the weekend, High Representative Borrell was in Oxford, where I am at the moment, and he was telling basically this level of resentment, from time to time legitimate, you can say about Gaza or this or that Europeans are facing, but some of them simply, you have been part of an old global regime. And to be honest, if you want to be resentful, it's much lower cost to be resentful to the Europeans than to the Americans. Because Americans, basically, you can dislike much, but there is power. You cannot ignore. So suddenly, for example, you go and start to talk about climate change with some of the countries outside of the West, and they're saying, what about what you did during COVID? How much vaccination we get? Do you remember that basically there was 150% vaccines for Europeans at the moment when there was around 7-8% for the other parts of Africa and so on? I do believe we should be also prepared for this reality. It can be right or wrong, but it is a reality. When basically our diplomats went around the world trying to argue for Ukraine, people were saying, is this the first war? Do you know how many people are dying in Ethiopia? Do you know how many people are dying in Sudan? So I'm saying this because as a result of it, European Union was great at adopting and surviving. And this was the mechanism. But it is always giving you a time dimension. Let's put it in a very brutal way. European Union was the wisest animal, but a slow one. And in a certain way, what in my view is changing is the time dimension. The pressure, the time pressure for decision making, the time pressure of basically what is going to happen or not happen is going to be much bigger than ever before. And as a result of it, these European elections, in my view, are going to be critically important because they're not simply going to force European Union to take positions on the changing world, which is beyond our control, what is going to happen in the US or what the Chinese or the Russians are going to do, but also trying to convince the European publics that we can control time. And I'm going to end up on this. Euro-pessimism is a much bigger threat than Euro-skepticism, because Eurosceptics did not have an alternative. They were kind of angry people. Some of their arguments could be legitimate. They have nothing to offer. And to be honest, Britain is the greatest example of this. The worst thing that can happen to Eurosceptic is to win. Euro-pessimism is challenging, and I'm ending on this on two different levels. One is its paralyzing sense. Nevertheless, of what we are doing is not enough. But secondly, we risk to become in a position of a person who committed a suicide out of the fear of death, which means you can basically push you, we cannot do this, we cannot do this, we cannot do this, and then basically you really have a problem. So how to be decisive on time level in such a difficult structure is really the question. This is a question that cannot be answered by a lecture. It should be answered by the Eurofound, and you're in a good position because it is in Ireland. Thank you so much.